Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Feinerman. I'm the Associate Dean for International and Transnational Programs here at Georgetown. I'd like to welcome you to this program. In the few minutes that I have 3 brief tasks to accomplish, which I will try to do quickly so that you'll be able to benefit from the wisdom of our panel. First of all, I want to welcome everyone to Georgetown Law, although many of you are already here, and say something for just a moment about our program in international economic law, which is managed by my colleague, Professor Chris-Brummer, and introduce the speakers who will follow me on the podium. Georgetown is one of the world's great centers for the study of international affairs, and the Institute of International Economic Law is the focal point for the study of international economic law at the university. It was founded in 1999 by our late colleague, the university professor John H. Jackson, and is now directed by Professor Chris Brummer. And the IAL's objective is to facilitate thoughtful and scholarly research and teaching, convene stakeholder meetings and conferences such as this to bring together public and private sector leaders, and offer executive education, which we'll be doing next month, on a broad range of subjects that concern the law of international economic activity. Originally focused on trade, as you'll see in today's conversation on Brexit, the Institute's portfolio has grown in recent years to include leading capabilities and international renown in a range of areas, including international monetary affairs, investment and arbitration, financial regulation, tax, and business law. And in each one of those fields, I have colleagues who are leading global experts on this subject. Since its inception, the IAL has worked closely with U.S. government agencies, foreign embassies, and international organizations, including those here in Washington, such as the World Bank, but also the UN, the IMF, and the WTO. We spend enormous time providing more analysis and technical assistance to these organizations, and having our students offer technical assistance on subjects like nuclear proliferation in our trade lab, and hosting events on foreign sovereign immunity, sovereign debt, and systemic risk. Let me introduce our moderator and panelists from my left, but your right. Chris Brummer, who's the director of the IAEL. Prior to joining Georgetown's faculty in 2009, Professor Brummer was an assistant professor of law at Vanderbilt Law School. He's also taught at the universities of Bâle, Heidelberg, and the London School of Economics, among others. He has also, for the last several summers, run our summer program in London. To his left is David O'Sullivan, the ambassador of the European Union to the United States. David O'Sullivan was appointed ambassador and head of the European Union delegation to the United States as of November 2014. Prior to his appointment as ambassador to the United States, Ambassador O'Sullivan served as the chief operating officer of the European External Action Service and was responsible for establishing this new EU diplomatic service, which is one of the largest diplomatic networks with 140 delegations across the globe. To his left is Peter Kmek, who's the ambassador of the Slovak Republic to the United States. Peter Kmek is a career diplomat of the Slovak Foreign Service. He graduated from Moscow State Institute of International Relations in 1990 and received a Doctor of Laws degree at Comenius University in Bratislava. In his 25 years of diplomatic work, Ambassador Kmek has served in Austria, Georgia, Israel, the USA, and Sweden. He's devoted most of his professional career to strengthening transatlantic relations, including U.S.-Slovak bilateral ties. During his first posting as Deputy Chief of Mission in 2003 to 2005, he was instrumental in facilitating the U.S. ratification process regarding Slovakia's accession to NATO. In his current position as Slovak ambassador to the United States since 2012, he's been actively promoting Slovak economic, trade, and innovation potential in the United States. To his left, Ambassador Gerardo No, who's the ambassador of France to the United States. Gerardo No is a career diplomat and was appointed ambassador of France to the United States in September of 2014. He previously held numerous positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Development, including, notably, that of Director for Strategic Affairs, Security, and Disarmament, Ambassador of France to Israel, Director General for Political Affairs and Security, and most recently, the Permanent Representative of France to the United Nations in New York. To his left, Ambassador Wittig, who served as German ambassador to the United States since April 2014. Prior to this, he was the German ambassador to the United Nations in New York and represented Germany during its tenure as a member of the UN Security Council in 2011 and 2012. There he drew on his wide experience in United Nations matters, having previously served as Director General for the United Nations and Global Issues at the German Foreign Office in Berlin. With such a formidable panel, I look forward to an interesting discussion, and thank you all for being here and for your time at this event. I'll hand things over to Chris to start the discussion.
Thank you, Jim. We here over at the Institute of International Economic Law have been extremely fortunate to have many of the policymakers, leading officials, regulators, diplomats, and policymakers here over at Georgetown, and our programming has really witnessed a bit of a renaissance here, and it's just such a pleasure to have all of you here today. I just wanted to thank as well Jennifer Hillman and Gary Horlick and the students of what, to our knowledge, is the only course in any law school focused exclusively on Brexit to help provide some of the questions that you'll be hearing today as we launch into a multitude and a range of issues across different policy issue areas. I think I'd want to start with Ambassador O'Sullivan, particularly since this conversation is being broadcast across the United States. Brexit has been one of the leading stories here, which is why there is such interest. And this has been in part due to the sheer unexpectedness of it all. What do you think, in particular as the representative of the European Union, that the causes were? And how do you believe Americans should interpret the drivers behind it? And I've encouraged the other ambassadors as well, even though one question may be directed towards any one of them, to jump in and to either challenge or supplement or agree to disagree. But Ambassador O'Sullivan.
Well, Chris, thank you very much indeed, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here, not least because my own daughter just graduated from Georgetown Law with an LLM in May. Unfortunately, I'm afraid she was rather more interested in human rights and refugee law than corporate taxation, which attests to her character but worries her father's pocketbook. And I'd like to congratulate you on starting a course in Brexit and the law, because if there's one thing we can say with certainty, there's probably not much we can say with certainty about Brexit, it's going to be a lawyer's paradise for many years to come. So I congratulate those of you who've taken this option, because I think you can probably spend the rest of your life dealing with the subject. To your question, I mean, we could probably spend a long time on the post-mortem of why it happened. I'm not so sure it was so surprising, to be frank. I know people in America were. Many of us in Europe were not so surprised. I think once we knew that the United Kingdom decided to have a referendum on this subject, it was always going to be a close call, whichever way it went. And Jean-Louis Bourlange, a former French member of the European Parliament, said just after the referendum that before the referendum, the position of the United Kingdom in relation to the European Union was 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and after the referendum, that situation was reversed. Yeah, some of you got that, yeah. I think it is true that there are a lot of UK-specific elements in this outcome. A hesitation about joining the European Union. The UK had a referendum only 2 years after they joined in 1973. They had a referendum to confirm that they actually wanted to still be a member. And I think, you know, the slightly semi-detached nature of British membership, they were not part of the euro, they were not part of Schengen. So I think there's always been a healthy, strong body of opinion in the UK which was frankly reluctant and reserved about membership, if not downright hostile. So I think once you open the possibility of a vote on this subject, it was always going to be a close call as to what came out of it. And I think in the end, it was the sense of wishing to take back control, as the Leave campaign put it, the sense of some kind of, in my view, respectfully, a misplaced sense of lost sovereignty, but I mean, I'm not now going to go through the merits of that argument, that won the day. So there were very specific UK elements which I don't think are easily replicated elsewhere across the system. Having said that, and I think this is very important, there are also you know, generic elements of the moment which you would find elsewhere in Europe, and which, by the way, to a certain extent you find here in the United States, in the sense this was also a sense of frustration with the way economic and social policy had developed, particularly since the crash in 2008, the financial crisis, and then the economic crisis. A sense of uncertainty generated by globalization. And of course in Europe, the European Union is seen very much as the front line of globalization, a mini regional globalization, if you like. And I think these elements, and of course the issue of immigration, though a unique feature of the UK, was a concern about intra-European immigration, perhaps more so than extra-European immigration, whereas I would say elsewhere in Europe the concerns about immigration are less about intra-European immigration and more about extra-European integration. But if we just use the words immigration, this is certainly a common theme across Europe, and we have challenges of populist parties arising in all our member states, and very often their criticisms go hand in hand with some degree of Euroscepticism. So there are also elements which are common across all of Europe at this point in time. What should the United States make of it? Well, I mean, Paul Simon says there are 50 ways to leave your lover. I don't know if there are 50 ways of Brexiting. But the first and most important thing is that we are not yet in a post-Brexit world. We are actually, you know, nothing has actually changed. Of course, something has changed fundamentally. We've had a very important political development in the United Kingdom. We know the United Kingdom is now going to leave. But the precise way in which that's going to operate and what is going to happen afterwards, or what is going to be the relationship, all of that is very much out in the open. I think the initial reaction in the United States, of course, is one of concern for what this means for the strong alliance with Europe. Obviously, it's easier from the point of view not just of the US, I imagine, but many of our partners, if we are 28 countries, a one-stop shop, all part of the same union. The fact that now an important member of the European Union is going to withdraw and develop separately, I imagine the US is concerned as to what this means for how we manage the relationship. It's of concern to all of us, frankly, and I think we will all be watching very carefully to see how this develops. I think the one thing I would say is I think we're all going to need a lot of strategic patience. This is going to take some time. We don't yet know what the United Kingdom is going to propose. The Prime Minister indicated triggering the Article 50, which is the formal article of the treaty by which exit takes place, sometime in the spring. There's a 2-year time frame in there. So, you know, we're looking at, I don't know, 2.5 years from now, perhaps, before we know with certainty exactly how the UK is leaving. The building of a new relationship between a UK out of the EU and the rest of the EU is probably going to take longer to negotiate under a different article of the treaty. So I think we're going to have to live with a certain degree of with uncertainty for many years to come. And we're all going to have to figure out how we do this, and we've never done it before in the European Union, with the exception of Greenland, which left in the early 80s, which is a much bigger country, but a slightly less complicated negotiation. But we've no precedent, and we are going to have to figure out how to do this. And it's going to take time, and probably things are going to evolve in ways that we cannot predict now. I appreciate, and that's just my final point, so I didn't mean to be too long, but it's an important subject. I appreciate that everyone wants to jump to the end point. I mean, I see so many articles proposing, I've figured out how this can be made to work. They may be right, and some of these ideas may ultimately be in the mix when we get there. But we've a lot of politics to go between now and the moment the British make their request to leave with their proposals as to how they would like to leave. Then will the 27, we will have to figure out how we react to that, what mandate the Commission is given to negotiate on behalf of the 27, and what kind of new relationship we will wish to build once we've worked out the terms of the separation. So we've a long way to go before we can really see exactly where this process leads us. There are certainly risks on both sides, but I'm sure that at the end of the day we will all try and make the best of what all of us reluctantly accept is a suboptimal situation, but one which we have to respect given the democratic vote in the United Kingdom.
Well, this is certainly an important issue, and given the fact that it really sets the stage for some of the more technical and legal questions that we'll be working through and thinking through in the course of this discussion, I wanted to also make sure that if there were any other comments or observations about how Brexit was either seen in your own countries or even differing interpretations as to whether or not there were specific catalysts, to please lend your views and your thoughts to this.
Maybe if you,
we'll just move down through the panel.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Professor Brummer. It's really my pleasure to sit among those EU insiders, very experienced colleagues from the EU. The reason I'm sitting here is actually also that Slovakia is holding the presidency of the European Council. And one of the main recommendations when you prepare your priorities is expect unexpected, and that's what exactly happened with Brexit in case of Slovakia. That happened just before we took over the Slovak presidency on July 1st. So the main focus of our presidency was actually to reflect on what to do both on the institutional side. The Council will be very much part of those considerations, how to negotiate the relationship with the UK in the future. And as we can see, there is actually mushrooming of the negotiating teams being under the Council, then under the European Commission. The European Parliament would like to have its say to the whole process. Of course, national governments are stepping in, national parliaments, public interest organizations, groups. So it will be a very complicated process from the institutional point of view. But also from the point of substance, as David mentioned. From the perspective of the Slovak presidency, we launched the process of reflection within the EU27. Bratislava held its first summit in mid-September, and we have 6 months to prepare our own reflections back to our capitals. So there will be 2 parallel processes. One will be actual negotiations with the UK, but also the second parallel process will be the reflection why this happened, why the UK decided to do so, and how to avoid the further disintegration of the European Union. David rightly mentioned that immigration was very much part of the negative outcome, and paradoxically so it happened from the internal immigration. So for Central and Eastern Europeans as part of the European Union will be very much important to focus on what kind of outcome we'll get, especially when it comes to the freedom of movement of the labor force, as many Central and Eastern Europeans move to the United Kingdom. So for us, the priority will be to keep the four freedoms untouched, or to be negotiated in balanced outcome. Thank you.
Ambassador.
First, that's great to be here. Thank you. Now, first, as a follow-up to what David said, why? I think, very frankly, Trumpism is a transatlantic phenomenon. You know, really, you have your presidential election. We have Brexit. In a lot of European countries, you have the far right. We are all facing the same wave of populism. And you know, I think it was Martin Wolf in the Financial Times saying that the losers of the globalization are rebelling. And so it's really, I think, a wide challenge that we are all facing, all Western democracies, and not only the Europeans, which means that whoever is elected president in this country, I think she will have to handle with us this issue. You know, why? In the US, why? In UK, in France, and elsewhere, we have so many of our citizens who are dissatisfied and who are telling us they are dissatisfied this way. The second element, I think, and here, in a sense, as a professional negotiator, the negotiation has not started, which means that there is, I would say, if I were not a diplomat, I would say there is some chest banging. It's normal that before any negotiation, all sides, you know, are saying they are not going to compromise, that their position, you know, you don't compromise of principles, and so on, and so on, and so on. So that's, I think, we are in a normal status before the opening of the negotiation. You know, people saying we won't compromise. Of course, there will be a compromise at the end of the day. And as David said, right now, we don't know what will be this compromise. Any negotiation has its own momentum, its own logic, and especially with this negotiation where you have 28 or 29 with the European Commission, you know, you have a lot of negotiators with a lot of different interests, sometimes divergent interests. I think it's totally impossible right now to know First, whether we'll reach an agreement, because, you know, we are 28, so it means a lot of red lines. And when we reach an agreement, and what will be this agreement. All of us, we want a good agreement. All of us, we want a mutually beneficial relationship with the UK. We are not on the revenge path. We are not on the resentment path. We are defending our interest and the interest of the Union. But it's so complicated that I think we are totally unable to tell you where we are going.
Ambassador Wittig.
Thank you, Chris. I also want to say thank you for including me in this panel. I'm a proud father of a Georgetown freshman in SFS, so I guess I should say Hoyas Saxa here.
Excellent.
Chris, you ask what does Brexit mean for the US? How should the US look at it? And I introduced sort of a geopolitical dimension to it, as important as the legal, technical, and economic aspects of that Brexit are. I think this added another challenge to Europe after the financial and economic crisis, after the Greek debt crisis, after the refugee crisis, and has hit, in a way, Europe in an already precarious state. And that has become a transatlantic issue. So now for the US, there is reason to worry. I'm not a doom and gloom prophet here about Europe, but I think there is reason to worry in the US about the strength and the resilience of the European Union. And we have a lot of challenge, a new assertive Russia, the refugee crisis, the fault lines that are emerging in Europe. So for the US, the challenge is to worry about the strength and resilience of the European Union, of the 27, quite frankly. We all are great allies of the UK, and we want to remain so. I mean, we are losing the second biggest economy in Europe. In our case, we're losing our sort of third biggest destination of export and our fifth trading partner. But what matters to us most, and it should matter also to the US, is the coherence of the 27, that Europe can remain the most privileged partner in the world of the US and a strong economically and political player on the global scene. Now, this will be the most complicated divorce in history that we have ahead of us. We all treading on entirely new territory. It's difficult to predict what will happen as far as my country is concerned and all of the other countries in Europe. We want relations that are as close as possible with the UK. We have a strong self-interest, but our priority is the unity of the 27 in Europe.
That brings up a wonderful set of issues for the lawyers and lawyers in training here for the audience. And those are some of the negotiation questions. Unity is important to the future of Europe, but in order to secure a deal, it has to be done with the consensus of the remaining European countries. Ambassador Kmek, I'll just sort of spin around. How have you seen negotiations progressing? Recently, EU member states and the heads of the EU members met in your capital, Bratislava, without UK Minister May in attendance, and there were some notable frictions along a range of policy dimensions, from migration to the support of southern economies. But what do you take, what are the takeaways from that summit, number one? And number two, how do you perceive those takeaways as interacting with the ability to negotiate all of the myriad details within the 2-year timeline that would be started once Article 50 is set in motion?
Thank you very much. As I mentioned, we see the whole process as two parallel chain of negotiations. It's really very important to reflect on the situation that has happened with Brexit. There'll be very complicated situations. Colleagues mentioned that there'll be, of course, red lines by different national capitals. It will go public, of course, and there'll be very many sentiments presented during those negotiations in public, and in many political streams that are actually eager to work on further disintegration of the European Union. So we need to be really cautious on how to move the European project further. And there are, of course, two main questions. How to keep building the European identity. The question is, are we there yet to have European identity? Because I met very few Europeans, if you ask them whether they are foremost, first of all Europeans, or they have the affiliation to their national identity, the latter will prevail. So we are not there to be Europeans, true Europeans. So this is very important message, especially to the young population that is leaning towards different radical and populist movements and messages. The second challenge in this reflection period will be how to move the whole project forward, because we already have 2-3-speed European Union, we have Eurozone, we have Schengen area, we have different layers of integration. So we need to reflect on where to actually build the ground zero now, and how to move. Will Eurozone will become a kind of fundamental playground now for the reflections to move further, or we have to step back and actually start working on the weakest link of the integration and move further.
Ambassador Aro, could you maybe discuss a little bit what we had talked about just momentarily in the green room about the technical aspects of getting those 27 members to agree on policy? What happens if there are disagreements? And certainly there will be some kind of negotiation dynamics, perhaps, where different member states want to use or think about Brexit as an opportunity to think deeper about not only their relationship with the European Union and the relationship of the UK with the remaining member states, but also the remaining member states writ large with one another. How difficult is this, and what are the kinds of steps that need to be put in place in order for those Article 50 negotiations to begin?
Well, again, as Peter said, as David said, you know, it's quite complicated. First, you know, when Brexit occurred, my first analysis was that, as usual, the British will be very good at dividing the 27. You know, the British diplomacy for 3 centuries has to be to divide the continental powers to avoid that there would be one main country on the continent. Half of the time it was against France, actually. So, you know, when you negotiate 1 against versus 27, you know, you can say it's much easier to be on the side of the 1 than on the side of the 27. But afterwards, I think there was a declaration of some of our, what we call our Visegrad partners, which means countries like Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, and who said very clearly there couldn't be a compromise limitation of the freedom of circulation of people. And for me, it meant, you know, really that when you need, you know, for instance, you know, you can imagine that one of the European countries, an EU country, would consider that the freedom of circulation of people is not that important, so it's ready to make a compromise on that to get something else. But at this point, you know, countries like Poland or Slovakia will step in saying, no way. And it's only an example, but it means that you are going to have in this negotiation, I don't know how many red lines. You know, every country will have its own red lines, making an overall compromise, because a compromise means that actually you are forgetting some red lines. So it will make the negotiation extremely difficult. You know, really, Because compromising, every time you will want to compromise on an item, you will have a country saying, no way, it's really for me a core interest. So that's what I call the difficulty of the negotiation. And frankly, I'm not that sure that we can reach a compromise, even if we really do want them. And maybe actually, when you saw that Prime Minister May was referring to a hard Brexit, it can be interpreted many ways. First, as I've said, a sort of chest banging, beginning of the negotiation to tell Europeans, you know, you don't frighten me, I'm ready to go, you know, to a hard Brexit. Or it may also a conclusion saying, I've looked at the negotiation, I really don't know how we can have a good, soft, mutually beneficial Brexit, or I'm ready to, I'm preparing all the, really everything, you know, all the you know, the ideas that we can find. So again, that's, I really want and as you said, and as Peter said, there are also many fault lines in the European Union. You know, as it was referred about immigration with our Eastern European friends, our main concern would be, of course, to maintain the unity of the 27. So it means that we are not going to accept that some UK demands, which may actually endanger the unity of the 27, you know, really. So that's also, I guess, an element which makes this negotiation still more difficult.
Ambassador Wittig, and then I know Ambassador
Yes,
OSullivan also
on this negotiation process. First of all, the notion of red lines has become toxic in this country and anywhere else, so I won't use that. But maybe sort of the premises under which we enter those or wait for the British to position themselves, because the ball is in their court. Number one, no pre-negotiations before they trigger Article 50. And number two, that's what my Chancellor and others, French President, have made clear, the integrity of the four freedoms. So an exiting country cannot be better off exiting outside the EU than it was as a member. And I think that's a very important principle. Otherwise, the EU would be in danger to unravel. Now, once Article 50 is triggered, and the Prime Minister of the UK said it will be happening by the end of March next year, there is a dynamic. It might be very amicable, but it might be also antagonistic, because behind all those seemingly technical issues are lurking, you know, political explosive issues. Now, but it's not only the Article 50 negotiations, and maybe to unfold the complexity of the whole thing, there are many more processes. There is the process of devising a new trade arrangement for the UK in case they don't want, you know, the Norwegian model, sort of buying into the single market. There is the replacement of all the EU existing free trade agreements with other countries. Those are 53. Well, that's the British problem. That's now our problem. Then there is this pressing, I think for the British, this very pressing demand to think about a transition. That's extremely important. What happens, you know, to fill the gap between the end of the Article 50 negotiations after 2 years and the new arrangements. And then there is, for the British, the challenge to renegotiate the WTO membership, which they have only by virtue, right now, by virtue of the European Union. And then there is the other issue, how to sort of redevise the relationship in foreign policy, in cooperation of the intelligence services, or justice and home affairs arrangements, etc. So you can see it's not just this one Article 50 dividing up the assets, but it's a whole lot of arrangements that have to be sought, and that's the complexity and the daunting task of the British they have in front of them.
Ambassador OSullivan.
No, I mean, I think Gerard and Peter have sketched out the sort of politics of it, and Peter also a little bit the mechanics. Just on the mechanics, I mean, I think one of the great achievements of the European Union is the institutions and the The institutional dynamic will be the following. When the United Kingdom eventually triggers Article 50, it will be up to the Commission to propose to the member states, the 27, a negotiating position. And that will turn into a mandate, which is adopted by the 27, which is then the basis on which the Commission, on behalf of the 27, will engage with the United Kingdom. And I think it's very important to understand, going to the point about different red lines, ultimately, that is how we in the European Union overcome our internal differences, because we actually have to agree on a common position, which will be the sort of initial response to whatever it is that the British put on the table. And that is the dynamic at all stages. The Commission will be managing the negotiations, but under ultimately the supervision of the member states and the European Parliament. And that dynamic is never to be underestimated as being quite different from conducting a classic diplomatic negotiation with 27 partners around whom you can go and talk and try to reach a consensus. There is actually a legal structure within which this will happen. And as Peter has rightly said, Article 50 is only one part of this negotiation. It is essentially the airbrushing of the UK out of the treaties and all the tidying up that needs to be done to make that happen. Now, that is actually quite complicated, but at the end of the day, it's relatively straightforward in the sense of what you're trying to do. The second part, however, is what is the new relationship, and that is going to be infinitely more complicated. That will not be negotiated under Article 50. That will be negotiated under some other article of the treaty, depending on what the UK suggests and proposes as the starting point. And then, given that Article 50 has a time limit of 2 years, there is no time limit on the negotiating the new arrangement. And I mean, depending on what that is, if it is a classical trade agreement, then the classical time frame would be 6, 7, 8 years, something along those lines. That's what it typically takes to negotiate an important trade agreement. Maybe it could be done slightly quickly, but more quickly, but that's the sort of time frame. And then there is, as Peter says, there's going to be a question then, well, what is there a transition between the end of the Article 50 and the completion of the new relationship? All of this is uncharted territory. I mean, nobody has ever been here before, and we're going to find out how this works. But I do think that in terms of the most important message I want to give is in terms of the 27, there will be now a dynamic of the relationship of the Commission operating on behalf of the 27 under ultimately the political control of the 27 and the European Parliament to forge common positions and to address the issues which the UK will put on the table. And that is, as I say, very different from the positions taken by individual countries at different points, as both Gerard and Peter have said, different people going out and speaking and taking positions. It's one thing what you say, this is my national position at this point in time. It's quite another when you then have to sit round at 27 and agree a common position which you will ask the Commission to present to the United Kingdom.
So I've been struck by this common theme of compromise. Perhaps it's because I have such an accomplished diplomatic set of panelists here. But by its very implication, it seems to imply then that the UK at the end of this process, as uncharted as it may be, that at the end of the day, one would more likely than not expect the UK to still have a status that's somewhat different from other third countries out there, and that even when one thinks about some of the fundamental freedoms enshrined in the European Union, that really it's not an on-off switch, but more or less a spectrum of potential possibilities that can be negotiated. No.
Well, sorry, I don't think everything is up for negotiation. I think that needs to be clear, and I think Peter made very clear, and others have made very clear. The single market is the 4 freedoms. So when I sometimes hear people talk about, well, we'd like access to the single market but without freedom of movement, it's a contradiction in terms. The single market is the 4 freedoms, including the freedom of movement of people. If you want a trade access to the European Union without freedom of movement, it's something else. So, I mean, I think there are certain fundamental values of the European Union which will be maintained and which are, I won't say non-negotiable, but which are absolutely at the core of the difference between being in the European Union and being outside the European Union. So I think, yes, there will be, as others have said, everyone comes to this as adults wishing a sensible outcome. The UK is never going to be a typical third country. It's an integral part of the European geography and history. It's part of NATO. It's an ally in so many other respects. No one is going to want to damage that relationship. On the other hand, there is going to be a difference, as colleagues have said, between being inside the European Union and being outside it. And I think that is something that we're now going to explore, how that is developed. But I think the idea that everything is up for negotiation and it's all the spectrum and that somehow any outcome is possible, I think, frankly, that I don't actually think that is where we are at the moment.
Wonderful. Ambassador No, I wanted to continue this conversation perhaps a little bit about what's going on then within Europe. From your vantage point, do you believe that the answer, in light of some of the tensions, to be an antidote to be more Europe or less Europe? It's certainly an important question, and there are lots of different responses, and the French government in particular has taken a very interesting position, I think, when it comes to everything from military bases and military solidarity to rethinking the economic bases of varying regulatory agendas. If you had any comments or thoughts on that.
When you ask the question to a French diplomat, more Europe or less Europe, immediately the answer is better Europe. You know, really, so I have done my job. So better Europe. No, again, the problem that we have been facing is obviously the fact that a lot of our citizens, and not only in the UK, a lot of our citizens are disenchanted versus Europe, or are considering that Europe, as I think David said, was only the front line of globalization. For my generation, you know, Europe was something which really we couldn't even question. You know, it was the way of avoiding war, the war which have devastated the continent. It was also prosperity and security from the Soviet Union. It was all these elements. But obviously for a lot of Europeans, and especially young Europeans, it's not anymore the case. So we have to answer to their concerns. So, you know, already, you know, some decisions have been taken, you know, for instance, to have a real bodyguard, you know, a real bodyguard on the borders of Europe. You know, really, it's clear that the immigration crisis has been a strong element in the vote of the British, and it's a general concern throughout Europe, and not only in Eastern Europe, but throughout Europe. So we have to ensure the safety of our borders if we want to keep the freedom of circulation. We have also to answer in terms of security. Security, you know, we are threatened and we are victims of terrorism. So it means that, for instance, we could have a sort of, you know what is the ESTA. You know, the ESTA for every foreigner entering the US, you know, he has to fill an ESTA before arriving. We could have an European ESTA, you know, really, which would be a way also of checking the circulation of the people. Another element is that prosperity. You know, the crisis of the European Union is also largely the result of the economic crisis, the economic stagnation that actually most of the European countries are going through. And now, since you have very generously exported the economic crisis to Europe in 2008, 2009, so we need investments in key areas. And again, there are also the question about tax. You know, the tax. You saw that Apple has succeeded to pay 0.005% of its profit in Europe as a tax in Europe. You know, that's totally unacceptable in not only, you know, in a sense in financial terms, but also in political terms. We have to also think in terms of tax fairness, social fairness. So we have all a sort of questions to answer, which don't really are not obliging us into a sort of debate about more or less Europe. Again, it's better Europe, and a Europe which is responding to the concerns of our citizens.
And I wanted Ambassador Wittig to respond as well. You've penned a very interesting and well-written and thoughtful op-ed in the Washington Post called "Don't Write Europe Off." And in light of your comments there, and in light of Ambassador Arot's comments, how do you view this question of more and less Europe? And do we not write them off, but instead write them on to more and better Europe?
Yes, I do think that Americans and all of us, we should not write Europe off. Although, I must admit, this Brexit came as a shock. And it really triggered also a lot of soul searching, which is now the phase that we are in, and it's kind of natural that we are now questioning ourselves, what can we do better? I think it's three things. First, we've got to deliver better on the expectations of our citizens. We've got to regain their trust and ask at each and every measure, how does this benefit the citizen? Does he see tangible results? Second, and my French friend I think has mentioned this, we've got to focus on the core business. And the core business is defense. Here, France and Germany have presented some ideas to make Europe a stronger defense union, not a competition to NATO, but harmonize that better with NATO, to protect better its internal and external borders, to fight terrorism. Also, the economic dimension, be a more competitive Europe, work on youth unemployment, those issues. And there we really have to focus what is it that we can do only together as 27, and that's what we should do. And the third thing is, we've got to unmask the truth behind all those rhetoric, the anti-Brussels, anti-EU rhetoric that is rampant in Europe. I'm taking this seriously. I don't want to brush it away. And I think there are real issues behind it of so-called losers of globalization. But there is also a scapegoating in a big way going on. And some of us in the member states are guilty of blaming Brussels for our own defects and what is going on or what is going wrong in our countries. That has to stop. Otherwise, we will not regain the trust of our citizens.
I know that there are some questions in the audience, and I'm going to the extent to which folks have microphones to begin keying up that process, this is probably a pretty good time, although I have many, many more questions. But one for Ambassador O'Sullivan, which I think a lot of folks here in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country may be interested in. Japan and other countries have highlighted the fact that third-party countries, like the United States, have an interest in Brexit, not just because it's one of the really the largest trading bloc and a key partner to the United States, but there are questions that arise as to the rights of third-party countries where they have interests either in the UK or frankly vice versa. What can or should folks in the United States do to really think through what the likely outcome is for those interests? And to what extent has Washington, D.C. been involved in those discussions in the European Union?
Well, I think that's a good question. Firstly, there have not been a huge amount of discussions. I mean, I think it is quite important to get this message across, because I sometimes people think we're already engaged in almost the end game of this discussion, and frankly, we haven't even begun. We are at a very, very early stage. You can see from the discussions which we all follow in the press, the intensity of the debate within the United Kingdom, and every morning brings some new revelation of disagreement or a different approach. And frankly, I think we owe it to the British government and people to give them the space to try and sort all this out and come forward in due course with a sort of thought out position which reflects how they see this and where they want to go. And until that happens, frankly, it's very difficult for the rest of us to actually respond beyond the sort of things we've been saying here, which I think are protecting our interests as the 27, but also wishing to have the best possible relationship in this new world, whatever it looks like, with a close friend and ally, which will be the United Kingdom under any circumstances. So I think the first thing I would say, and you're absolutely right, I think this is a big question which affects everyone. I mean, this is one of these tricky issues where you have a referendum in one country, which I understand, which is within the jurisdictions of one sovereign nation, but which actually has ramifications for everyone. I mean, it has ramifications for the rest of us in the EU, because it profoundly affects the future development of the European Union, but it has profound effects for alliances like the United States, both geopolitical and geostrategic, as Peter Wittig was saying, but also economic and commercial. Massive US investment in Europe and massive US investment in the UK. What are those investments now worth? How are they going to be managed going forward? And the Japanese, of course, have come forward with a very elaborate paper setting out their concerns, because they're also a major investor. And I think Peter Wittig also mentioned the ongoing trade agreements. We have 53 trade agreements with nearly all the major economies of the world. We're just about, hopefully, to conclude a very important deal now with Canada, and we have them with South Korea. We're negotiating with Japan. We're upgrading our deal with Mexico, with Chile, negotiating with Mercosur. All these agreements, again, the stakes are high as to how do we deal with a UK which is no longer a party potentially to those agreements. So the global stakes of this are also very high. My first advice, however, to everyone from outside is, on the one hand, to be as honest as they can with the UK about how they perceive this and what they perceive as their interests and what they would like, because I think the UK needs to have that information before it takes its sovereign decision. But secondly, to keep a little distance from this and to let us, as Europeans, try to find a way forward. I think people jumping too quickly to say, oh no, I've figured it out, I know what you need to do, this is it, and this is also a process which is going to take a certain amount of time to work its way through our respective political systems, both on the part of the United Kingdom and on the part of the 27. As we go forward over the next 2.5 years, thinking will evolve, we will understand better what are the issues, what might be the solutions, what might work. So I think ultimately, my earlier message is one of just a bit of patience and letting time do its own job in this is going to be an important part. You can't rush to judgment on any of these issues, especially when there are just so many issues which are new, and where we really will need time to figure out how we can arrive at solutions which respect the decision of the British people in the referendum, the interests and values of the 27 as part of a European Union going forward, with the strong commitment, political and economic, that we have to taking the process of European integration further, and our international partners who have a very strong stake, and the investment in Europe, which we will wish to protect and continue to have an environment in Europe which is conducive to attracting foreign direct investment, which is vital for our competitiveness and future well-being.
Maybe just one short comment to David's statement on this gradual process. Some of the colleagues mentioned that the ball is now on the UK side, and it's really very important to watch the dynamics of the final decision by the UK, be it government only, or there are some considerations that the British Parliament has to step in order, of course, to vote for the Great Repeal Act, but also to have a say whether they would like to have a hard Brexit or rather a softer Brexit. The second thing is, second internal dynamics is the situation in Scotland. The question remains whether the UK or London will represent the whole UK, or there will be certain dynamics in this dimension. That will influence definitely the considerations on the EU 27 side, because, as you know, we are facing the elections to the European Parliament in the second half of 2019, and we have to decide whether we need to prepare the election for 27 or still for 28. So it's needs to be a gradual process, but I don't want to serve as a devil's advocate, but I think that March 2017 might not be the last deadline for presenting the UK position. Thank you.
Interesting. I did see some hands up. Mr. Tran. Do we have a microphone? Oh, excellent.
Thank you. Hung Tran from the Institute of International Finance. And I would like to ask any of the ambassadors, whoever would like to respond. I think that so far both the UK and the EU 27 seem to have agreed on one thing, and that is inter-EU immigration is a bad thing. The UK say we want the benefit of single market, but without the burden of, here I mean inter-EU immigration, not extra EU immigration. The rest of the EU say no, four freedoms have to go together with single market. You cannot cherry pick, meaning you cannot have the good parts and without the bad parts, that is immigration. Can you change the narrative to say that inter-EU immigration is one of the best things that has ever happened to the EU because it helped countries in the EU with aging population to grow more than otherwise it could?
Would anyone like to? Great question.
No,
I'm sorry.
Oh, Peter, please.
Well, I don't know whether you can change the narrative. Immigration is such a powerful paradigm right now, and it inspires a lot of fears. But maybe just a reminder how this came about. In 2004, the EU accepted in a big bang 10 mostly Eastern European countries. And that was a measure to stabilize Eastern Europe. Some of them were probably not as mature to enter the EU as we would have wished, but it was one of those assets of the European Union to prove that it is a project of peace, stability and prosperity, more than an economic club. And at that time, many leaders said it's too early to grant them freedom of movement and settle down and exercise their profession. So we agreed, or most of the countries agreed, to have a transition period of 7 years to waive that freedom of movement. And there were two, if I'm not mistaken, two countries that didn't accept that waiver, and that was Sweden and the UK.
And Ireland.
And Ireland. And so it was Prime Minister Blair at the time who said they're all welcome. They should come. So they came from Poland, from other countries, and in a way, if I may say so, it was a self-inflicted wound that later on there was a certain resentment in the UK against those intra-EU immigration. Although at a previous stage, I think it's safe to say that this immigration benefited not only the immigrants, but also the EU-UK economy. And maybe, well, it's not a story to change the narrative, but it's useful to remember that story.
If I may just, I mean, I think Peter is absolutely right, historically correct, and I think it is true that perhaps the UK, as being the single biggest of the three economies that opened, though you had very large numbers of Central and Eastern European people coming to Ireland. I mean, 250,000 Poles, 50, 60,000 Latvians, still living there, working there, even though many went back in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, many are coming back again, and there is absolutely no resentment in Ireland over this migration, which everyone thinks has been beneficial to all concerned. And I think, generally speaking, that was the point I made in my introductory remarks, intra-European migration is not a problem in Europe. The populist vote and the populist criticism of immigration tends to focus much more on extra-European migration, and particularly with the recent refugee crisis and the asylum seekers, people coming from outside Europe. So I think it is important to make that distinction, that most people in the European Union think the freedom of movement of people, of Europeans within Europe, is an enormous benefit. And we were talking earlier about young people. I think we have a new generation in Europe which, as has already been said, takes for granted so much of this. and perhaps doesn't understand quite how far we've come. Those of us who actually lived through, immigration controls, capital controls, controls on employment going back to the 70s and 80s, how far we have come in Europe and what we have built as an integrated. And young people basically take that for granted and just move seamlessly. And it was very interesting to note in the UK the generational difference in the voting pattern. Again, I don't want to, it's not for us to interpret how the UK people voted, but it is interesting to note that the majority of young people tended to favor strongly remaining, and it was the older generation who tended to favor leaving. So I think actually the European Union from that point of view is already a success with our young people, and I think many, many young people in Europe would wish us to maintain this possibility of freedom of movement.
From an outside perspective, and just to piggyback off of this question and your response about populism, how well suited is the European Union as a highly technocratic organization to engage with this question of populism? Is this really a responsibility that is something that the member states have to take upon themselves? Certainly the drivers, I think, between whether or not it be migration, the refugee crisis, there's a different intensity of policy preferences depending on what people's direct experiences are with each of those phenomena. How well suited, I mean, even where you have reforms in key European institutions like the European Parliament, how well suited is Europe, and what can nation states, particularly when you look at what's happening in France and you look at what's happening in Germany, what exactly can they do to engage this?
Can I just say a quick, I mean, I'm sure my colleagues want to respond on that, but I agree entirely with you. I mean, Peter Wittig, I thought, said it very well. I mean, Brussels is held in about as much esteem in the rest of Europe as Washington is in the rest of the United States. All politics is local. And at the end of the day, it is very difficult for the people in Brussels to get through to other parts of our national democracy and indeed subnational democracy. And this is we have a common ownership of the European Union. It's not just the institutions in Brussels are the creatures of what member states collectively have wanted to build as a form of European governance. We, of course, are answerable and accountable also for our mistakes and for the things we get wrong. But at the end of the day, it is for the national politicians to explain to their citizens the benefits, some of the costs perhaps of European integration, and why this is ultimately in their best interest. And I think we need, and that was the point I think Peter Wittig was saying, we need a renewed effort of communication about how this European Union has worked, what it has delivered, what it does and what it does not do, what it is responsible for and what it is not responsible for, and how we get this synergy between these two levels, doing things, as Gerardo said. When we get better outcomes by doing it together, we should do it together. When we don't need to do it together and we can perfectly leave member states to do it, they should continue to be 100% responsible for that. Getting that message across is, in my view, very much also the responsibility of national politicians, and you are right, the European institutions on their own are absolutely not going to be convincing in passing that message.
No, again, I do agree. There is a basic principle of the European Union, which is called, in our slang, subsidiarity, which means that you should make the things at the level where it's the most effective level, the most convenient level to do it, between Europe and the national basis. So as Peter said, we have to focus the European Union on its core business. What should we do at the European level? Because, we are not going to build the United States of Europe. We are old countries, old nations with a very, very long history, very strong commitment of our citizens to our national identity. And furthermore, let's face it, like in Europe, like in the US, we have a wave of nationalism. Really all our opinions, maybe because they are afraid by globalization, but they are going back to the national roots. So we have to find the right balance. Let's do what is necessary to do at the national level, and the rest at the EU level.
Well, Chris, you asked how can a elaborate organizational structure that the EU has really counter the rise of populism. And I think this is the challenge that not only the EU has, but it was said before, that it's a common challenge of the liberal Western democracies. It's a challenge of the West. I'm not so sure whether we can speak of a crisis of the West, but it's certainly a rather dramatic challenge of the West, the rise of populism. And I think there are two aspects to it. The economic, social aspects and the identity politics of it. There are losers of globalization. We should not kid ourselves. It's not a win-win, global development. There are losers, and we have to win back those losers. And we have social tools, we have economic tools. Some of them are better. I think we are better placed in many aspects in Europe than in the US, because we have a more elaborate sort of social system. We can retrain people when they lose their jobs in the rust belts that we have too. And our welfare state system looks potentially better after those people. But we also have, and that's much more difficult to address, the loss of identity. And that is something I think we've got to struggle with. How can we harmonize the idea of a common Europe, which should be all our house, with the rooms that are in it that should be still regional and national? And there's no easy answer to that, but that is one of the biggest challenges.
Great. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, and we are unfortunately about out of time. But I did want to give at least each of you the opportunity to maybe offer if a silver lining, perhaps, in terms of your views as to what or whether this experience provides a silver lining or opportunities for Europe. And if you could identify maybe one or two of what those potentially silver linings may be. We have a lot of students here. They're looking forward to the future. And I think, particularly as lawyers, it's useful to look at potential opportunities, besides apparently jobs, that Brexit may be able to create. Ambassador O'Sullivan.
Well, Karl Popper said optimism is a duty, and I always remain optimistic. But I have to be very honest with you. I cannot see this Brexit decision as anything other than rather regrettable and not likely to have many opportunities. We can certainly make the best of it. We can try to ensure that it does the least damage, but I genuinely think it is a decision which is ultimately going to leave us all slightly poorer and slightly less well off than if the UK had stayed. I have to be honest about that, because I think we will all work diligently, I think, with the British government to try to deal with this, both the exit and the building of a new relationship, in the most constructive way possible. But the net result, I'm afraid, is probably a weaker UK and, frankly, a slightly diminished EU 27. As Peter said, we're losing one of our largest member states, a permanent seat in the Security Council, a nuclear weapons state, a state with huge diplomatic experience and adding a lot to our collective value. It's very regrettable. I'm not questioning the right of the British people to decide what they've decided, or putting into question that we now have to work with that. But to find the silver lining probably indeed will be that we will have to figure out how to do this in the best way possible, and that will probably require creativity and innovation on the part of all of us. But my overall conclusion is that this is not the best outcome either for Europe or for the transatlantic alliance. It will certainly complicate matters. But we will all work diligently to try to make the best we can out of what is, for me, unfortunately, nonetheless, a second best outcome.
Well, on that happy note, Ambassador.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
In spite of the Brexit referendum and outcome, I think that the main challenge is to win back the confidence of the Europeans, and including UK population, and especially this refers mainly to the young people who need to feel the ownership of the whole project, because it's about them actually to move the whole project forward. The second thing is actually that has been mentioned by Peter. we are really being challenged by other forms of governance when it comes to liberal democracy, and this is the main challenge of the transatlantic agenda, that we have even different attempts to form alternatives to liberal democracies, even within the European Union. So we need to explain the benefits and the contribution of the liberal democracy in the current modern world, and that also refers to the globalized developments. Thank you.
Ambassador Rowe, just to sort of add maybe a little bit to this, any opportunities for consolidating opinions with one less chair around the table?
Well, I think I'm not, really, the UK has always been a very good scapegoat, of the blockage in Brussels, and actually they enjoyed to be accused of blocking the consensus in Brussels, and from time to time, actually, they were the ones blocking it. But I don't think it will change dramatically the chemistry around the table of the European Council. No, it's a sad day. It was, we have the right, even for diplomats, even for French diplomats, to be emotional. Actually, to try to build a European Union without the UK, really, frankly, sounds weird. The British are an integral part, an essential part of Europe in every sense of the word. Really, they were our best enemies in the history, and really, we want to keep them on board. And, but last point, as I've said, now the time is to respond to the concerns of our citizens. And the concerns of our citizens are about identity, it has been said. And here maybe I'm going to be controversial, but I think we have to decide what are the borders of Europe. Europe has to end somewhere. We simply can't have a sort of open space. We need an identity, a common culture, a common civilization. We need also to defend our citizens, as I've said, to defend our welfare state, because something very difficult to understand from the US, but the welfare state is a part of our identity, European identity, and we have to defend the welfare state, which is not easy in a globalized world. So basically, the European market shouldn't be a social jungle. The European market shouldn't be a tax jungle. We have to really to defend, I think, we have to defend our values. We have also not to be naive. Our single market is also, really versus some countries out of the single market, and which are actually competing on an unfair basis with our economy. So a lot of things to do, and I think it will be, I guess, a good summary that I think my colleague will agree. The citizen, our citizen, has to be more than ever, really the center of our policy.
Well, Chris, no silver lining. I think we lost an ally. We lost a great free market economy. We lost a beacon of freedom in history. We lost a country that brought all those virtues to the table: pragmatism, common sense. But if there are if there's an upside after the Brexit decision, it's two things. First, it's a shock that helps us to refocus. And second, it was mentioned, it might help to mobilize the youth, because they are the hope for a future Europe, and they really are in favor, mostly, of all the assets of the European Union. And I just hope that there will be more of a voice and more vociferous in Europe after this shock.
Wonderful. Well, with this wonderful, wonderful conversation, let's give our guests an applause, and thank you so much, ambassadors, for your time.
Thank you very much. So much. Thank you.